Your name isn't on our guest list." The words cut through the air like a knife, meant to wound, meant to dismiss. Marcus stood there, paint still beneath his fingernails, his worn jacket a stark contrast to the designer suits and shimmering dresses that filled the grand auction hall. His own creation, the painting that had been stolen from his studio 6 months ago, hung on display behind the security guard, priced at more than he'd made in his entire career. In the corner of the room, a figure in a black hat stopped mid-conversation, his attention drawn to the commotion at the entrance. The Belleview Auction House glittered with wealth, crystal chandeliers casting rainbows across marble floors, champagne flowing freely among the elite of the art world. The Phoenix Rising, Marcus's masterpiece, was lot number 17, expected to fetch upwards of $2 million. 6 months of desperate searching had led him here, to this moment, to this confrontation. The security guard's hand moved to his earpiece, his other palm flat against Marcus's chest. Around them, conversations quieted as the wealthy attendees turned to watch, some with amusement, others with mild discomfort, at this disruption of their exclusive evening. "That painting was stolen from my studio," Marcus's voice cracked with emotion. "I never sold it. I never consigned it. I'm the artist." His words hung in the air, met with uncomfortable glances and dismissive chuckles. The auctioneer approached, his smile practiced and cold. "Sir, we have proper provenance for all our items. Perhaps you're confused." As security began to pull Marcus toward the exit, nobody noticed how the man in the black hat had removed his sunglasses, revealing eyes that had witnessed this scene before, in life and in the characters he'd played. Johnny Depp had seen enough. Marcus Reeves had spent the last decade of his life creating art that nobody seemed to notice. His tiny apartment doubled as his studio, the smell of oils and turpentine a permanent fixture in his life. The Phoenix Rising had been different, a breakthrough piece, the culmination of everything he'd learned, everything he'd felt. Then one morning, after a gallery showing that had yielded no sales but plenty of praise, he'd returned to find his door jimmied open, his masterpiece gone. The police report went nowhere. Insurance didn't cover the full value. Months passed with no leads until a former classmate texted him a photo of the Bellevue Auction catalog. There it was, his painting, listed with a different title and no mention of his name. He'd called the auction house dozens of times, sent emails with photos of the work in progress, provided documentation of the theft, all ignored. Tonight was his last chance. The security guard's grip tightened on his arm. "Sir, I'm going to need you to leave now." Faces turned away, uncomfortable with this breach of decorum, but unwilling to intervene. The wealthy didn't like to be reminded of the messiness behind their acquisitions. Art was supposed to appear as if by magic, ready to be bought and sold, the artists themselves an inconvenient detail in the transaction. The auctioneer, Charles Whitmore, moved with practiced grace, his tailored suit and perfect smile the uniform of high society. He leaned in close to Marcus, voice low but sharp. "This is a private event. The provenance of Lot 17 has been thoroughly verified. If you continue to make a scene, we will be forced to call the police." Around them, the whispering grew. A woman in diamonds clutched her catalog tighter. A man in a velvet smoking jacket chuckled to his companion. Starving artists, always looking for a handout. Marcus pulled free from the guard's grip. "I can prove it's mine. There's an underpainting, a different composition beneath the final work. I painted over a portrait of my mother. No one knows that but me." Whitmore's smile didn't reach his eyes. "How convenient, an invisible proof only you can verify." He signaled to a second security guard. "Please escort this gentleman out." In the corner, Johnny Depp set down his champagne glass. He'd come tonight at the invitation of a friend, with no intention of bidding. Famous for his own artistic pursuits and his collection of rare works, he'd developed a keen eye not just for art, but for authenticity, in paintings and in people. Something in the young artist's desperation rang true, a familiar note of genuine anguish he'd seen too many times in an industry built on taking credit for others' creations. The security guards flanked Marcus now, one on each arm, his face flushed with humiliation as they began to force him toward the exit. Phones emerged from designer purses and tailored pockets, not to help, but to record. Tomorrow, he would be nothing more than a viral moment, a cautionary tale about what happens when you don't belong. "I put 3 years of my life into that painting," Marcus shouted, his voice breaking. "You can't just—" "Sir, please don't make this more difficult," the guard muttered, tightening his grip. A small crowd had formed around them, the entertainment before the main event. Some looked embarrassed, others amused. None intervened. This was the natural order of things, the haves and the have-nots, clearly delineated. The auctioneer cleared his throat, preparing to address the room, to smooth over this unpleasantness with a joke perhaps, something to unite the crowd against the outsider, to restore the comfort of their exclusive bubble. That's when the voice came from behind them, quiet but commanding, with a distinctive cadence instantly recognizable to everyone in the room. "I'd like to hear what he has to say." The crowd parted like water. Johnny Depp stood there, casual in his signature eclectic style, hat tilted low over his eyes, but unmistakable. Conversations halted. The auctioneer's practiced smile faltered. The guards' grips loosened in surprise. The entire auction house seemed to hold its breath. Johnny Depp moved forward with that peculiar grace he'd become known for, somewhere between a swagger and a glide. He was dressed simply by the standards of the room: dark jeans, a vintage jacket, several scarves layered around his neck, and an assortment of rings that caught the light as he gestured toward Marcus. "I believe this gentleman was explaining something about an underpainting," Johnny said, his voice carrying that slight drawl that had become his trademark. His eyes, lined with a hint of kohl, moved from Marcus to the auctioneer with the keen assessment of someone who'd studied human nature for decades. Whitmore recovered quickly, his professional smile snapping back into place. "Mr. Depp, what an unexpected pleasure. I wasn't aware you were on tonight's guest list." "Last-minute thing," Johnny replied with a casual wave. "Friend of a friend. You know how it goes." He turned to Marcus. "You're the artist?" Before Marcus could answer, Whitmore interjected, his voice honeyed but firm. "Mr. Depp, I assure you, we've vetted the provenance of every piece in tonight's auction. This young man is simply confused." "Actually," Johnny interrupted, "I'd like to hear it from him." He locked eyes with Marcus. "Tell me about this painting." The security guards, uncertain now, looked to Whitmore for direction. The crowd had grown, phones discreetly recording this unexpected drama. The wealthy collectors who'd come expecting nothing more exciting than a bidding war were now witnessing something far more entertaining, a real-life confrontation with a Hollywood star at its center. Marcus swallowed hard, aware that this might be his only chance. "It's called Resurrection Through Ashes, not Phoenix Rising. I painted it after my apartment burned down 3 years ago. I lost everything, but somehow found a way to create again." Johnny nodded, his expression thoughtful, gaze intense beneath the brim of his hat. "And the underpainting you mentioned?" "It's a portrait of my mother," Marcus said, his voice steadier now. "She died in the fire. I started painting her, but it was too painful. So I painted over it, transformed grief into rebirth. You can see it with infrared imaging. Her face is still there, underneath the phoenix." A murmur moved through the crowd. Whitmore's smile tightened. "A touching story, truly, but I'm afraid anecdotal evidence isn't sufficient to halt a properly documented auction." Johnny turned to him, head tilted slightly. "Infrared imaging is hardly anecdotal, Charles. It's actually quite scientific." He pronounced the name with a hint of irony, as if testing its authenticity. I've had several of my own acquisitions examined that way. Fascinating what lies beneath the surface of things, isn't it? A woman in the front row, silver-haired, dripping with emeralds, raised her catalog. I was planning to bid on Lot 17. I would very much like to know if there's a question about its provenance. Others nodded in agreement. Once seed of doubt had been planted, it grew quickly. The room's energy had shifted. What had been a dismissal of the artist was becoming a questioning of the auction house itself. Whitmore's composure slipped momentarily. "Ladies and gentlemen, I assure you, our authentication process should be simple enough to verify," Johnny interjected. He turned to face the room. "I happen to know someone at the Metropolitan Museum's Conservation Department. They have portable infrared equipment. One call, maybe an hour's wait." He checked his watch. "Plenty of time before Lot 17 comes up." Phones emerged again, but this time for a different reason, to search for information about the painting, about Marcus Reeves, about art theft. The crowd that had been so unified in its dismissal of the artist was fragmenting, some still loyal to the established order, others intrigued by the possibility of scandal and deception. Whitmore's face had reddened beneath his perfect tan. "Mr. Depp, while we appreciate your concern, we cannot delay an auction based on unfounded accusations. We have a certificate of authenticity and a clear chain of ownership." Johnny's eyebrow arched slightly. "I'd be interested to see that chain of ownership." He turned to Marcus. "When was your painting stolen?" 6 months ago, April 17th. I filed a police report that same day." Johnny nodded and turned back to Whitmore. "And when did your client acquire this piece?" The auctioneer's hesitation was brief but noticeable. "I'm not at liberty to disclose confidential client information." A man near the back called out, "Was it before or after April?" Several others echoed the question. The room had transformed. What had been a controlled environment, the auction house's carefully cultivated ecosystem where the wealthy felt secure in their purchases, was now charged with uncertainty. Whispers circulated about other auctions, other questionable provenances, other artists who had claimed theft. Johnny stepped closer to the painting, studying it with genuine appreciation. "It's really quite remarkable work," he said, loudly enough for the room to hear. "The layering of the colors, the texture, there's a raw emotion here that can't be faked." He turned back to Marcus. "You have other works?" Marcus nodded. "Nothing this size, nothing this important." "Importance is subjective," Johnny replied with a slight smile. "I've found that the art world often confuses price with value." Phones were rising now, recording this exchange. Tomorrow, it wouldn't just be Marcus who went viral, it would be this entire confrontation, this clash between institutional power and individual creativity, with Johnny Depp cast in a role he hadn't played before, champion of the unknown artist. Whitmore stepped forward decisively. "Mr. Depp, perhaps we could discuss this privately. I'm sure we can reach an accommodation that satisfies everyone." Johnny's smile didn't reach his eyes. "I don't think this is a matter for private discussion anymore, do you, Charles? Too many people watching now." The double doors at the back of the auction house swung open dramatically. A woman in a crisp blazer strode in, flanked by 2 uniformed police officers. She carried a leather portfolio and moved with the confident authority of someone who didn't need to be invited. "Detective Sanchez, Art Crimes Division," she announced, holding up her badge. "We received an interesting call about Lot 17. The crowd parted to let her through, murmurs rising to a steady hum. Whitmore's professional demeanor slipped further, his eyes darting between the detective, Johnny Depp, and the exit doors. "I don't understand," the auctioneer stammered. "Who called you?" Johnny shrugged with exaggerated innocence. "I may have texted a friend while we were talking. Detective Sanchez and I met during that unfortunate business with the counterfeit Basquiat's last year." He offered a conspirator's wink to the crowd, who responded with nervous laughter, relieved to be positioned as insiders rather than potential accomplices. Detective Sanchez approached the painting, her gaze clinical and assessing. "We've been tracking several high-end art thefts over the past 18 months. Interesting pattern. Smaller artists, emerging talents, works that haven't hit the million-dollar mark yet but show promise." She turned to Marcus. "Mr. Reeves, I reviewed your police report on the way over. You have identification?" Marcus fumbled for his wallet, hands trembling slightly as he produced his driver's license. The detective examined it, nodded, then turned toward Whitmore. "Mr. Whitmore, I'll need to see the provenance documentation for this piece immediately." The auctioneer's smile had vanished completely. "Our paperwork is all in order, Detective. This is simply a misunderstanding." Johnny stepped forward, standing shoulder to shoulder with Marcus. "Misunderstandings seem to happen a lot in the art world, don't they? Paintings misattributed, provenances confused, artists forgotten." He gestured toward the painting. "Art gets stolen twice. Once when it's taken from the studio, and again when the artist's name is erased from its history." Detective Sanchez opened her leather portfolio, extracting several documents. "Mr. Whitmore, your consignor for this piece is listed as Meridian Gallery, correct?" She didn't wait for his confirmation. "Meridian has appeared in 3 other cases of disputed provenance in the past year." Quite a coincidence. The room had gone silent, the wealthy collectors suddenly aware they might be unwitting participants in something unsavory. Art theft was an abstract concept until it stood before you in worn jeans with paint under his fingernails. Whitmore's composure cracked. We rely on our consignors to provide accurate information. Belleview can't be held responsible for—" "Due diligence," Johnny interrupted, his voice carrying easily through the hushed room. "Isn't that the term? The obligation to verify what you're selling?" He turned to address the crowd directly, the charisma that had drawn millions to theaters now focused on this impromptu stage. "We all love beautiful things, but beauty isn't separate from truth, is it? Not real beauty." Phones recorded his every word, capturing not just what he said, but how he said it, with the quiet intensity he'd brought to his most memorable roles. This wasn't Captain Jack Sparrow's flamboyance or Edward Scissorhands' vulnerability. This was something else, a raw authenticity rarely glimpsed behind carefully managed public personas. "I've spent my life pretending to be other people," Johnny continued, "playing roles, telling stories, but even in fiction, there's a kind of truth we're searching for." He gestured toward Marcus's painting. "That's what art does. It tells truth through beauty, but only if we honor where it comes from, who it comes from." Detective Sanchez had moved to examine the painting more closely. "Mr. Reeves, you mentioned an underpainting, a portrait?" Marcus nodded, finding his voice again. "My mother, in the lower right quadrant, beneath the wing of the phoenix, her face is turned slightly to the left." The detective nodded to one of the officers, who approached with what appeared to be a specialized tablet. "Infrared scanner," she explained. "Standard equipment for art authentication now." The officer held the scanner up to the painting, moving it slowly across the canvas. The image appeared on the tablet screen, visible to those closest. Where the vibrant colors of the phoenix should have been, ghostly outlines emerged, the unmistakable features of a woman's face partially visible beneath layers of paint. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. The evidence was undeniable. "That's her," Marcus whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "That's my mother." Johnny placed a hand on the young artist's shoulder, a gesture both protective and validating. Detective Sanchez turned to Whitmore, who had paled visibly. "Mr. Whitmore, I'm placing a hold on Lot 17, pending a full investigation." She gestured to her officers. "We'll need complete access to your provenance documentation, communications with Meridian Gallery, and any other relevant records." The auctioneer's carefully constructed world was collapsing around him. "This is highly irregular," he protested weakly. "Our clients expect—" "Your clients expect legitimate art," Johnny interjected, his voice carrying a hint of steel beneath the velvet, "not stolen pieces with falsified histories." The crowd had shifted completely now, their sympathies realigned. The story had changed. They were no longer passive observers of an unfortunate disruption, but witnesses to justice being served, with a Hollywood icon as its unexpected agent. Whitmore made one final attempt to salvage the situation. "Mr. Depp, surely you understand the complexities of the art market. These misattributions happen in even the most reputable circles." Johnny's smile was dangerous in its gentleness. "I understand perfectly. I understand that somewhere along the way we decided that the people who buy art matter more than the people who create it." He turned to the assembled collectors, his gaze sweeping the room. "But without artists, without their vision, their struggle, their truth, what exactly are we collecting? Just expensive decorations with empty provenances?" The room fell silent, his words hanging in the air like a challenge. In that moment, with phones recording and social media algorithms primed to amplify, a simple auction had transformed into something much more profound, a reckoning about value, truth, and the voices that get silenced in the spaces where wealth speaks loudest. The auction proceeded that evening, but Lot 17 was conspicuously absent. Marcus's painting had been carefully removed, logged as evidence, and promised to be returned to him once the investigation concluded. The crowd had thinned somewhat, several collectors disappearing quietly after hasty conversations with their art advisors about their own collection's provenances. In the aftermath, Marcus found himself in the auction house's private lounge, still processing the evening's events. Detective Sanchez had taken his detailed statement, promising to follow up on what appeared to be an organized operation targeting emerging artists. "Your statement will help build the case," she'd told him. "You're not the only one this has happened to." Johnny Depp sat across from him now, two untouched glasses of whiskey between them. The actor's presence was different up close, more contemplative, less performative than his public persona suggested. "Thank you," Marcus said finally, breaking the silence. "I never thought— why would someone like you help someone like me?" Johnny considered the question, running a finger along the rim of his glass. "Someone like you?" He smiled slightly. "You mean an artist who had something valuable stolen? Who wasn't being heard?" He shrugged. "Seems like reason enough." Outside, the story was already spreading. Johnny defended an artist was trending, clips of his impromptu speech about art and truth circulating across platforms. The narrative had crystallized into something simple yet powerful, a beloved actor standing up for an unknown artist against the elite art establishment. "Your work is extraordinary," Johnny said, finally lifting his glass. "That phoenix, there's something almost musical about how you captured the light through the wings." Marcus nodded, still struggling to process that Johnny Depp was discussing his technique. "It was all I had left after the fire, this compulsion to create something from the ashes." He hesitated. "Most days I paint for no one but myself. It's strange to think that painting became valuable enough to steal only when other people decided it was worth something." Johnny's expression darkened slightly. Value and worth aren't the same thing. The art world confuses them constantly. He set down his glass. "I've spent decades watching how quickly people's perceptions can change. One day you're worthless, the next you're priceless, and neither has much to do with who you actually are." Someone knocked gently on the door, a member of Johnny's security team discreetly signaling it was time to leave. "They've arranged for your painting to be securely stored until it can be returned to you," Johnny said, standing. "Detective Sanchez is good at what she does. This won't be the last domino to fall." 3 weeks later, Marcus sat in his tiny studio apartment, surrounded by canvases and the familiar scent of linseed oil. His phone hadn't stopped buzzing since that night. Galleries that had previously ignored his submissions were suddenly interested in his work. Art blogs were featuring his story. The investigation had uncovered a network of theft-targeting emerging artists, with 3 arrests already made. On his easel stood a new painting, larger, bolder, still unfinished, but promising. Beside it, propped carefully against the wall, Resurrection Through Ashes had finally returned home. His phone buzzed again, a text message from a number he'd saved but still couldn't quite believe was real. "Just checking in. How's the new work coming?" J.D. Marcus smiled, thinking of their conversation that night after the cameras had stopped recording. Johnny had spoken about his own struggles with authenticity, with having his work valued for the wrong reasons, with fighting to protect what was truly his. "Art belongs to those who create it," Johnny had told him, "not just those who can afford to buy it. Never forget that." Outside his window, the city continued its relentless pace. Inside, in this small space filled with half-finished dreams and newly rekindled hope, Marcus picked up his brush again. The story that had gone viral wasn't just about a famous actor stepping in to help an unknown artist. It was about something more fundamental, the right of creators to own their creations, and the power of truth to eventually emerge, even in spaces built to silence it.